So, podcast show notes. What's all the hullabaloo? What's the big idea? Well, by publishing episodes without podcast show notes, you're actually missing an opportunity to increase your website traffic tenfold. So in this video, we are going to tell you everything you need to know in regards to why you should be writing them, and as well as the best ways to sort of go about it, really.
Are you looking for a podcast or radio show to appear on? Are you struggling to find a guest for your podcast or radio show? Let me introduce you to MatchMaker.fm. Simply create a profile, narrow your niche, and use the inbuilt messenger to contact potential partners. And the best part, it's free to sign up. So, let's find your match.
But what are podcast show notes exactly? Well, in short, they act as a central information hub for your episodes. So they provide relevant contextual detail, transcripts, timestamps, links to helpful resources, and more. They can contain whatever they want. You see, well-written show notes, they create an incentive for your existing listeners to come and visit your site. And they also help strengthen the overall SEO presence within your podcast. So yeah, they do take a little bit of extra time to create, typically sort of 20 to 30 minutes if you're not using AI, which again, we don't recommend using entirely. Just dabble in. But don't, use it as the main bolster for your argument. But no, they are fairly straightforward once you know what to include. 5 reasons why you should write show notes. Number 1, it gives audiences more context. So show notes are the perfect place to tell your listeners a bit more about each episode. And again, we'll get into the specifics, the semantics of what your note should include later, but generally their purpose is to inform the listener on what they can expect from tuning in. So whether it's a bit more insight into the topic or the guest, providing more information is key to satisfying those invested listeners who just want to dig a little deeper. Do you remember that song? It was a tune. Number 2, writing podcast show notes, well, it encourages listeners to visit your website. Because Google prioritizes the written word over literally anything else, podcasts alone aren't overly discoverable, sadly. So this means you need to do the legwork. You need to whack in some extra SEO work to get noticed. And show notes are a good, easy way of driving traffic to your website in that respect. So one simple way you can do this is by directing listeners to check out the full show notes on your website. So yeah, providing some form of written content to accompany your podcast, it lets Google's algorithm acknowledge, read, and rank your content. So you're helping yourself out tenfold, really. Number 3, writing podcast show notes lets you cross-promote older episodes. If you're constantly putting out new episodes, it's easy for older ones to become buried in your backlog and forgotten by your fans. And if there's a particular episode that you're really proud of and you like to walk down memory lane, well, it would be a shame for it to never come out and see the light of day again. Imagine your favourite episode of Friends coming on and you never get to see Pivot ever again. I mean, it's reprehensible, Anyway, millennial references aside, using show notes to cross-promote previous episodes of your own podcast can help stop this from happening. So, for example, if a newer episode relates to an older one and you think your audience might be interested in it, well, listing it in your show notes, it can be quite helpful. Number 4, podcast show notes, they make episodes more shareable. Podcast show notes are not only good for encouraging engagement, but they're also really easy for listeners to share amongst their peers, and that's what we want them to do. We do. So if they've already made their way over to your website and the content is useful to them, they will be far more inclined to share it with somebody else. And if you don't incorporate show notes into your overall podcast marketing strategy, it's a lot harder for the listener to do so. See, everyone uses different podcast listening apps, so sharing a single URL accessible to pretty much everyone, it's a lot more practical, really. Number 5, podcast show notes encourage people to hit subscribe. While getting people to your website is the main goal of creating show notes, they can also encourage people to subscribe to your podcast if they haven't already. So they do translate directly into new listeners. It's a win-win. So if they like what they see on the podcast show notes, they might be tempted to tap the subscribe button on the page whilst they're there. As long as you've got a persuasive one, we'll get into it. 10 things to include in your podcast show notes. So we've gone to the liberty of listing everything that you should include in your podcast show notes just to make them as helpful as possible. Let's get into it. Number 1, a quick summary of the episode. So the first thing you should strive to include is, of course, a summary of the episode at hand. Keep it short, keep it snappy. The aim is to hook them in. So try to also round up what the episode is about, what topics it touches on, and what the reader will learn from it. But don't put too much in, because obviously you want them to listen. Don't spoil it. The thing is, you might even want to add in, a thought-provoking question to get them thinking. If you can spark their interest from the get-go, the chance of them hitting the play button will be a lot higher. Number 2, information about your guest. So if you've got a great guest speaking on your episode, of an actor, somebody from the industry, an expert in the history of shoelaces on your shoelace podcast, well, providing readers with some context is super important. Telling your audience who the guest is, especially if they're not immediately recognizable outside of their field, what they do, why you've asked them to speak, is effective for drawing people in. And again, especially if it's someone you're unlikely to have heard of before, it will also help to shine a platform on them, and they will really appreciate it and likely recommend to their peers to come and feature on your podcast in future. It really is a sort of help me, help you, help me, help you situation, So yeah, make sure you don't ramble on too long though, just like I have. You should keep kind of the most relevant bits unique to the audio. Like I say, no spoilers. But, adding in a headshot and links to their social feeds of the guest is also useful. It means that people can sort of link back, have a little look in, and just generally see whether, they feel that this guest is worth their time. Also, a little tip here, if you are going to ask your guests for any headshots, ask well in advance so you're not waiting around for it after the recording. You want to get podcast episodes out there as quick as possible. Number 3, main talking points. Putting the episode's main talking points into the show notes is a key factor. But be careful with this though, because whilst you want to give the reader a good representation of the topics being discussed, like I said before, no spoilers, you don't want to give it all away too soon, because what you do want is for them to actually sit and listen to the episode and put their time into it. You need to really create a sense of excitement or intrigue around your main discussion points. Number 4, interesting quotes from the episode. When you're setting out the main points of each episode, picking out an intriguing or funny quote is a great way of convincing the reader to listen. So don't overdo it. 1, 2 is enough. We don't need a transcript. Nobody knows your audience more than you, so you know really what they're looking for within this. Choose one that you know will appeal to them. That's really important. So we'd recommend noting the exact time of the quote just to make it easier for them to find it in the episode. You don't want to sort of cause annoyance. You don't want to alienate your listeners. Number 5, timestamps. Timestamps tell the reader exactly when each topic is being discussed in the episode, so it's basically a nice way of not wasting your listeners' time without them asking your audience to commit to the entire episode when really they might well only be interested in one topic. So breaking down each episode into sections will not only earn respect, but it might also entice more people to listen in the first place. If you can appeal to their needs and directly point them to what they're looking for, they'll be more likely to listen. Number 6, the episode's audio. Keeping everything in one place, well, it makes it easier listenership, and that's why you should also embed the actual episode into your podcast show notes. Your listeners, they won't want to be flicking between various apps and browsers back and forth, back and forth. We live in a time where everyone wants everything as fast as possible, as easily as possible. Hello? TikTok exists, We're all about the 9-second content. The attention spans are different to how they used to be 20 years ago. So just make it as quick, accessible, and easy as possible. All you need to do is include the audio version somewhere on the page so the reader can easily find it. Generally speaking, towards the top of the page is the best place to embed the audio file. Not only does it look kind of cleaner, but it's the first thing that, your readers will be drawn to. Number 7, a transcript of the episode, though this is optional. There are a few different reasons why adding a transcription of your podcast into your show notes can be worthwhile. It's good SEO practice for one, which is the main aim of writing them in the first place. It's also a great way of making your podcast more accessible because some of your listeners may be hard of hearing. Providing an alternative, it's an effective way of being far more inclusive. Transcribing your audio by hand, it would take a very, very long time. I'm not saying you have to do it with an ink and quill, but regardless, it'd take ages. Well, fortunately, we are in the 21st century. You don't need to do that. There's plenty of automated transcription services out there that could create one in minutes, just like R1 over at podcast.co. All you need to do then is tidy up the raw transcript to correct any typos and make sure it's clear who's talking and when. Providing a transcript is an essential element, but again, it is a nice way to go above and beyond to enhance the user experience for listeners and just show them that, you're respecting their needs and wishes. Number 8, affiliate and sponsor links. If you've got any affiliate links, sponsorship deals, merch, or live events to shout about, podcast show notes are a great place to list them. People do them all over the shop. Even look in our bio, we've got them in there. You see, it's always a great idea to give a bit of context too, just so the reader can understand why you're working with certain brands or people, or why you're going to a certain event. It's also a great way of building trust amongst your community. Number 9, links to other helpful resources. This one's super important. When editing your episode, make note of any useful books, websites, resources, referenced by you, mentioned by you, or your guest, whatever the case. It's good practice to clearly signpost all of these in your show notes. Doing so, it creates a strong incentive for invested listeners to visit your website to learn more. And you don't need to necessarily justify each time you reference somebody. Just make sure that you mention them somewhere on that page. You absolutely need to give credit where credit's due. Let listeners know where they can find all the resources in your episode intros with a quick CTA. Number 10, call to actions. So yeah, we just mentioned a CTA and I realised I didn't really explain a CTA. Well, a good way to conclude your podcast show notes is with a call to action. So you might want to direct them to your social feeds, review pages or newsletters. CTAs are a key driver of engagement and giving your audience a couple of instructions, it can play a big part in the growth of your brand. It also shows them that you're reachable, and once again, this is key for building a community around your podcast. Here's the stylistic do's of show notes. Before you put pen to paper and start drafting your show note masterpiece, there's a few stylistic elements to keep in mind. Make sure they're clear and concise. The simpler the better. When writing your podcast show notes, get to the point quickly. Don't use more words than you need to. I myself, I'm a seasoned waffler. I know the struggle. I get it. But large blocks of text, they can put people off. And if they're too difficult to digest, readers will probably just bounce and go somewhere else. Also, make sure to always use headings and subheadings. It's another thing you can do to make your content a lot easier to digest. And on that topic, make sure to keep those podcast notes SEO friendly. Don't forget to stick to a consistent format, because really you should be writing podcast show notes for every episode you release. Make sure you're keeping them as consistent as the podcast releases. Make sure they all follow the same layout, structure and design. Creating a strong brand identity, it helps listeners to become familiar with who you are. The little details matter more than you think. As always, thank you so much for watching. We really hope you enjoyed this video. Happy podcasting. Get on with them podcast show notes. We can't wait to see them. Ta-ra!